"You really shouldn't order that steak if you're planning to pay for it," the waitress said, and in that single moment, the entire atmosphere of the small downtown Chicago steakhouse seemed to shift as Jason Miller slowly lifted his eyes from the menu, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally speak to him honestly. The place was warm with low amber lighting, the soft clink of silverware mixing with quiet conversations, the smell of seared meat and butter filling the air like something almost too comforting for a city that never truly slept, and Jason, dressed in a simple dark jacket that gave nothing away about who he was, sat alone at a corner table near the window where rain traced thin lines down the glass like fleeting thoughts no one bothered to hold on to. Sarah Collins stood beside him holding a notepad, her expression calm but direct in a way that suggested she had seen enough customers pretend and fail to impress her by now, and she had no patience for games. Especially not from men who ordered the most expensive cut of steak without even glancing at the price. Jason closed the menu slowly, not offended, not surprised, just quietly observing her as if her words had confirmed something he already knew about the world, that people always made assumptions before they ever looked twice. "Is it that obvious?" he asked, his voice steady, almost curious, and Sarah hesitated for half a second because most customers either got defensive or laughed, but this man did neither, which unsettled her more than any complaint would have. She glanced at the table again, noticing the way he sat upright but not rigid, the way his hands were calm, the way his eyes didn't chase attention but seemed to absorb everything around him. "It's not obvious," she replied carefully, "but that steak is $89, and people who don't ask about the price usually end up asking for the manager later." Jason nodded slightly as if accepting a fact rather than a warning, then looked past her toward the kitchen where the rhythm of chefs moving behind the counter felt like a different world entirely. "Do people here always assume the worst first?" he asked quietly, and Sarah almost laughed but didn't, because there was something in his tone that didn't match the usual arrogance or charm she dealt with on a nightly basis. Instead it felt like someone genuinely asking, not accusing, and that made her pause longer than she intended. Outside, a taxi splashed through a puddle, headlights briefly illuminating the restaurant interior before fading again, and in that flicker of light Jason's presence seemed even more understated. Almost intentionally so, like a man who had chosen invisibility rather than been given it. Sarah tapped her pen once against her pad, breaking the silence. "Look, I'm just saying, it's a good steak, but it's not cheap, and I don't want you surprised when the bill comes." Jason finally gave a faint smile, small and unreadable, and said, "I don't think I'll be surprised by the bill," which made something in Sarah's expression shift, not quite suspicion anymore, but curiosity she didn't invite. She wrote nothing down, still standing there longer than she should have, while Jason leaned back slightly in his chair, watching the room as if he were studying a pattern no one else could see, and for the first time that evening, the waitress wondered if she had misjudged him completely, or if she had just stepped into the first moment of a night that would quietly change everything she thought she understood about people who walked into her section and ordered without hesitation. Sarah did not move right away after walking back toward the kitchen, but the words she had just spoken kept replaying in her mind like a quiet echo she could not easily dismiss, because there was something about the man at table corner that did not fit the usual pattern of customers she dealt with every night in the steakhouse, and that feeling only grew stronger when she returned a few minutes later carrying a glass of water he had not even requested. Jason Miller remained seated exactly as before, calm and observant, his attention shifting briefly toward her as she approached, as if he had already sensed her return before she stepped into view, and Sarah placed the glass gently on the table while trying not to overthink why she suddenly felt the need to observe him more carefully than any other guest. "Are you sure you would still like to proceed with the steak?" she asked again, softer this time, almost as if she was giving him one final chance to reconsider, and Jason looked up at her with the same quiet steadiness that made it difficult to read him. "I am sure," he said simply, as though certainty was not something he needed to defend. From across the dining room, the manager, Richard Hayes, had been watching the interaction longer than he intended, and now he began walking toward their section with the practiced confidence of someone who preferred control over curiosity, his expression tightening slightly as he approached the table. "Is everything all right here?" Richard asked, stopping just beside Sarah, his eyes quickly scanning Jason's appearance in a way that suggested judgment came before understanding in his world, and Sarah opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, because she was no longer entirely certain what was normal about the situation. Jason remained quiet, giving no reaction to the manager's presence, instead calmly placing the menu down as if he were simply waiting for service to continue, and that silence made Richard even more alert, because people who had nothing to prove usually did not sit that calmly under scrutiny. "Sir, I just want to make sure you are aware of the pricing before we proceed," Richard added, his tone polite but edged with assumption, and Jason finally turned his attention toward him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I am aware," Jason replied evenly, and the simplicity of the answer left no room for argument, yet it did not satisfy Richard, who had already made up his mind that something about this guest did not belong in a restaurant like this. Sarah watched the exchange closely, noticing how Jason did not react defensively, did not attempt to impress, and did not show even the slightest discomfort, which made her question why the manager seemed more unsettled than the guest himself. Richard cleared his throat and nodded, still unconvinced. "Very well, we will proceed then," he said before turning slightly toward Sarah, signaling her to continue service, but his eyes lingered on Jason for a second longer than necessary. As he walked away, Sarah leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "I am sorry about that, he can be a little intense sometimes," but Jason gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "He is doing his job," he said, as though he understood behavior more deeply than he was letting on. Moments later, Sarah returned with the kitchen order ticket and confirmed the steak. But before she could leave, Jason added a simple request for a glass of red wine, something mid-range but thoughtfully selected, and she nodded, surprised that he did not default to anything extravagant despite earlier assumptions. In the background, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, yet Sarah could feel a subtle shift forming, like the air before a storm that did not announce itself loudly but changed everything in silence. And as she walked back toward the counter, she could not shake the feeling that Jason Miller was not just another guest passing through their section, but someone whose presence would soon force everyone in the room to reconsider what they thought they understood about status, identity, and the quiet ways power often revealed itself without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The restaurant had settled back into its usual rhythm after the brief tension at the table, but Sarah Collins could not shake the unease that had quietly anchored itself in her thoughts as she moved between tables, taking orders and delivering plates with practiced efficiency while her attention kept drifting back toward the corner where Jason Miller remained seated with an unusual stillness that felt almost deliberate in a room filled with constant motion. He was not looking at his phone anymore, not scanning the menu, not watching the kitchen, but simply observing people as they passed, as if the entire dining room was a kind of pattern he was silently decoding, and that alone made him different from every other guest she had served that night. In the kitchen window, Sarah picked up the order ticket for his steak and paused for a fraction of a second, remembering the way he had not reacted when warned about the price, the way he had not shown irritation when questioned, and the way his voice carried a calm certainty that felt disconnected from the assumptions people usually made in places like this. She handed the ticket to the chef and then returned to the floor, only to notice that manager Richard Hayes was now speaking quietly with one of the other servers while occasionally glancing toward Jason's table, his expression still carrying that restrained skepticism that had not fully disappeared. A few minutes later, a new presence entered the dining room, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit who appeared to know Richard personally, and the shift in energy was immediate as the manager straightened his posture and walked over to greet him. Briefly distracted from Jason's table, Sarah used that moment to approach Jason again, this time carrying the glass of red wine he had ordered, placing it gently on the table while trying not to analyze her own growing curiosity. "Your wine," she said simply, and Jason gave a small nod of acknowledgement before finally speaking in a tone that was quieter than before. "Thank you, Sarah," and hearing her name spoken so casually made her pause for just a moment because she did not remember telling him her name earlier. "I did not realize I had introduced myself," she said cautiously, and Jason's expression did not change, only a faint trace of something unreadable passing through his eyes. "You did not," he replied. "I read your name tag when you first approached the table, and there was no arrogance in the statement, only observation." Sarah exhaled slowly, slightly embarrassed at not noticing how carefully he had been paying attention, and she gave a small polite smile before stepping back toward the aisle. But before she could turn away completely, Jason spoke again. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" And she hesitated, then nodded. "Do you believe people usually see what is in front of them, or what they expect to see?" he asked, and the question lingered in the air between them longer than she expected, because it did not sound like small talk, but something closer to reflection, and she was not sure how to answer it immediately. Before she could respond, a loud laugh from another table briefly broke the moment, and when she looked back, Jason was already watching that direction instead of her, as if the question had been enough and no answer was required. Across the room, The man in the suit had now joined Richard at the bar, and Sarah caught fragments of their conversation, something about investments, property developments, and private dining contracts, all spoken in a tone that belonged to people used to making decisions that affected more than just a single restaurant. Jason's steak had not yet arrived, but the anticipation in the kitchen was beginning to build as the chef prepared it with unusual attention, and Sarah found herself wondering why a single order from a single guest felt like it was slowly changing the atmosphere of the entire night. When she glanced back at Jason again, she noticed he was no longer just observing quietly, but had turned slightly in his seat, his posture subtly alert, as if he had already recognized that the evening was moving toward a moment that would soon reveal more than anyone in the room currently understood. The moment the kitchen doors swung open carrying the finished steak toward Jason Miller's table, the entire rhythm of the restaurant subtly tightened as if everyone in the room had unconsciously agreed that something important was about to happen. Though no one could have explained why a single plate of food could carry that kind of weight, Sarah Collins was the one carrying it, her steps steady but her mind still replaying Jason's earlier question about perception and expectation, a question she had not fully answered because she had not fully understood it, and now she wondered if that had been intentional. She placed the plate in front of him carefully, the seared steak glistening under the warm lighting, accompanied by roasted vegetables and a small portion of mashed potatoes, all presented with the kind of precision the kitchen reserved for their highest quality dishes. Jason looked at it for a moment before looking up at her, not at the food, but at her, as if evaluating something beyond the plate itself. "This looks exactly as it should," he said calmly, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah pause because it sounded less like approval and more like confirmation of something expected. Before she could step away, manager Richard Hayes appeared beside the table again, this time with the suited man from earlier now standing a few feet behind him, both of them watching Jason with a level of attention that was beginning to draw subtle awareness from nearby tables. Richard cleared his throat, attempting to maintain professional composure. "I hope everything is satisfactory," he said, though his eyes kept flicking between Jason and the expensive cut of steak as if still waiting for a problem to reveal itself. Jason picked up his fork slowly, cutting into the steak with deliberate ease, and the silence around the table deepened slightly as Sarah and Richard both waited for his reaction. "It is prepared well," Jason said after a brief moment, and that simple statement seemed to relax no one, because it did not resolve anything. It only extended the uncertainty. The suited man leaned slightly toward Richard and whispered something Sarah could not hear, but she noticed Richard's expression shift, becoming more cautious, more attentive, and less dismissive than before. Jason continued eating without hurry, as if time had no particular urgency for him, while Sarah remained nearby under the pretense of checking on other tables, though her focus kept returning to the corner booth. When Jason finally set his fork down, he took a slow sip of water and spoke without looking at anyone in particular. "This restaurant has potential," he said, and the comment was so simple that it almost went unnoticed, but Richard immediately straightened, sensing either praise or evaluation. "We appreciate that," Richard responded quickly. "We are always open to improvement suggestions from valued guests." And for the first time Jason turned his attention directly toward him. "Valued is an interesting word," Jason said quietly, and the slight pause that followed made the air feel heavier. Though his tone remained calm and non-confrontational, Sarah noticed that the suited man had now stopped speaking entirely, watching Jason with growing focus, as if recognizing something just beyond familiarity but not yet able to place it. Jason reached for his wine again and added, almost casually, "Most places focus on the appearance of value rather than the experience of it," and that sentence landed differently than anything else spoken that evening, because it did not sound like criticism but like observation from someone who had seen many versions of the same pattern repeated elsewhere. Richard gave a small polite laugh, unsure how to respond, while Sarah felt a quiet shift in her understanding forming, as if the man she had warned earlier about ordering steak was not someone who needed advice about cost at all. The suited man finally stepped closer and spoke his first words directly toward Jason. "Excuse me, I think I recognize you," and that single sentence changed the air instantly, because Jason did not react with surprise, only with a calm acknowledgement that suggested recognition was not something new to him. Sarah stood still as she watched the exchange begin to turn toward something none of them had been prepared for, and in that growing silence, it became increasingly clear that the evening inside the small steakhouse was no longer just about a meal, but about to shift into something far more revealing than anyone serving or dining there had anticipated. The suited man stood still for a moment longer than anyone else expected, his eyes fixed on Jason Miller with a level of recognition that slowly shifted the entire atmosphere of the restaurant, and even the background noise of clinking plates and distant kitchen orders seemed to soften as if the room itself was waiting for confirmation of something unspoken. Sarah Collins remained near the side station, holding a clean order pad she no longer needed, her attention fully locked on the exchange unfolding at table corner, while manager Richard Hayes straightened his posture in a subtle attempt to regain authority over a situation that was clearly moving beyond his control. The suited man finally spoke again, his voice lower now, careful and deliberate. "I am certain I know you from somewhere," he said, and Jason Miller gently set his fork down, folding his hands in front of him with calm composure that felt almost unsettling in its control. "It is possible," Jason replied, neither confirming nor denying, and that single response only deepened the tension because it offered no direction for the conversation to settle into. Sarah noticed Richard glance toward her briefly, as if silently asking whether she understood what was happening, but she only shook her head slightly, just as uncertain as he was. The suited man stepped half a pace closer, lowering his voice further. "Jason Miller." "Miller Holdings," he said carefully, and at the mention of the name, something in the room changed instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet gravity that made several nearby diners pause mid-conversation. Sarah felt her breath slow as she processed the name, because it did not belong in a small neighborhood steakhouse. It belonged to headlines, business journals, and financial broadcasts she had only ever glanced at in passing. Richard Hayes blinked once, then again, his earlier confidence dissolving into something closer to disbelief as he tried to reconcile the guest in front of him with the identity just spoken aloud. Jason remained still, as if hearing his own name in that context was no different from hearing any other word, and after a brief silence he finally spoke. "I prefer to eat without introductions," he said calmly, which only confirmed the suited man's suspicion rather than easing it. Sarah stepped slightly forward without realizing it, drawn closer by instinct rather than intention, and she noticed the way Jason's presence had subtly redefined the entire space, as if every assumption the room had been operating under was now being quietly rewritten. Richard attempted to recover, forcing a professional tone. "We had no idea you were dining with us tonight, Mr. Miller," he said, but Jason gently interrupted. "That is usually the point." And the simplicity of that statement made Richard stop speaking entirely. The suited man nodded slowly, still processing. "I was at the Harbor Economic Forum 2 years ago," he said. "You were presenting the expansion model for urban development partnerships," and this time there was no ambiguity left in his voice, only certainty. Sarah watched Jason carefully, waiting for some visible reaction, but there was none, only a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes that suggested he had heard this kind of recognition many times before and had long since stopped needing to respond to it. The steakhouse, once just another busy evening shift for Sarah, now felt like it had narrowed into a single point of focus, and that focus was Jason Miller seated calmly at a corner table, eating a simple meal as if the identity just spoken aloud carried no weight over the present moment. Richard swallowed hard, clearly recalibrating every interaction he had initiated earlier, while Sarah felt a strange mixture of confusion and clarity forming at the same time, because nothing about Jason's behavior had changed, yet everything about how she understood him had shifted completely. And in that growing silence, as realization began to settle across the room, in fragments rather than announcements, it became clear that the evening had crossed a threshold from misunderstanding into revelation, though none of them yet understood what Jason Miller intended to do next or why he had chosen this place, this moment, and this exact way of being seen. The recognition of Jason Miller's identity did not create noise in the restaurant, but instead created something far more unsettling, which was a collective stillness that spread quietly from table to table as people began to sense that they were no longer simply dining in a normal evening service but instead witnessing a moment they would later struggle to explain to anyone else. Sarah Collins stood near the service station, her hand still holding the order pad without realizing she had not written anything on it for several minutes, because her attention was fully anchored on Jason, who remained seated with the same calm posture as before, as if the revelation of his identity had not altered anything about his intention or his experience. The suited man, still processing the confirmation, lowered his voice again. "If it is really you, then I do not understand why you are here like this," he said, gesturing subtly toward the simple meal in front of Jason, and the question lingered in the air with genuine confusion rather than challenge. Jason took a slow sip of water before responding, his tone measured and unhurried. "Because places are often understood differently when you are not recognized," he said, and the words seemed simple, but carried a weight that made Richard Hayes visibly uncomfortable, as though the foundation of how he managed his restaurant was being quietly examined. Sarah noticed Richard adjusting his tie slightly, a nervous habit she had never seen from him before, and she realized for the first time that authority could be fragile when it was no longer certain of itself. The suited man nodded slowly, still not satisfied. "But you could have called ahead, reserved the entire section, or arranged privacy," he said, and Jason gently placed his glass down, looking toward him with calm precision. "If I had done that, I would not see how things operate when no one is adjusting for my presence," he replied, and that answer seemed to remove any remaining doubt about whether Jason Miller was there by accident or design. Sarah felt a subtle shift in her understanding forming again, deeper than before, because this was not a man avoiding attention, but a man deliberately observing without influence, and that realization made her earlier warning about the steak feel strangely insignificant in comparison. Richard attempted to regain some control of the situation, stepping slightly closer to Sarah and speaking in a lowered tone. "We should ensure his experience is handled perfectly," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it usually carried, and Sarah simply nodded without responding verbally, because she was no longer sure what perfect meant in this context. Jason's attention briefly moved towards Sarah again, and for a moment their eyes met across the small distance between them. And instead of authority or distance, she saw something more observational, as if she had become part of the environment he was quietly evaluating rather than a participant in his experience. The suited man finally exhaled and leaned back slightly, accepting the reality even if he did not fully understand it. "I apologize for assuming otherwise earlier," he said, and Jason gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the apology without expanding it. The restaurant continued to function around them, orders being prepared, plates being delivered, conversations resuming in fragments, but everything now felt layered over the awareness of who was sitting in the corner booth. And Sarah found herself moving again, not out of routine but out of instinct, checking nearby tables while still keeping Jason within sight. As she passed the bar area, she overheard Richard speaking quietly with the suited man about development opportunities and future partnerships, but their conversation now carried a different tone, one shaped by recalculation rather than certainty. Sarah returned to her station and looked once more toward Jason, who had resumed eating with the same steady pace, and she realized that nothing about his behavior suggested he was waiting for recognition or reaction, because he had already moved beyond that point long before anyone else in the room had reached it. And in that realization, the evening shifted again, not toward resolution, but toward something still unfolding, as if Jason Miller's presence in the steakhouse was not an event that had happened, but a decision still in progress. The atmosphere inside the steakhouse had fully transformed into something quieter and more concentrated, not because the music had changed or the lighting had shifted, but because every person who remained aware of Jason Miller now understood that they were sharing space with someone whose presence could no longer be interpreted through ordinary assumptions. And yet Jason himself continued his meal with the same controlled simplicity as before, as if the reactions around him were only background noise to an experiment he had already completed internally. Sarah Collins found herself moving more slowly between tables, not because service had become difficult, but because her attention kept returning to the corner booth where Jason sat, and she noticed something subtle that others might have missed, which was that he was no longer observing the room with curiosity, but with completion, as though he had already gathered whatever information he came to collect. Richard Hayes stood near the bar area speaking with the suited man in a lowered voice, their earlier confidence replaced with cautious recalibration, and Sarah caught fragments of their conversation mentioning corporate hospitality partnerships and private dining exclusivity, but it was clear that their focus had shifted entirely toward understanding how Jason Miller's presence might affect their establishment beyond this single evening. At table corner, Jason gently set down his utensils again, not hurried, not distracted, and looked briefly toward the window where city lights reflected softly against the glass, and for a moment he appeared less like a guest and more like someone observing a system from within it. Sarah approached with the intention of checking whether he needed anything else, but before she could speak, Jason addressed her directly. "You were correct earlier," he said calmly, and the unexpected acknowledgement made her pause, because she was not sure what he was referring to until he continued, "about cautioning me regarding the steak," and there was no tone of correction in his voice, only recognition of her judgment in a situation she no longer felt confident about. "I was only trying to be responsible," Sarah replied carefully, unsure whether she was being evaluated or simply observed, and Jason gave a slight nod, "Responsibility is often underestimated until it is needed," he said, and that statement lingered between them longer than expected. Richard Hayes, noticing the exchange, stepped slightly closer again, now attempting to present himself with renewed professionalism. "Mr. Miller, if there is anything we can adjust to improve your experience, please let us know directly," he said. And Jason looked at him briefly without tension or authority in his expression, only clarity. "Your service is consistent," he replied, which was neither praise nor criticism, but something more neutral that left Richard visibly uncertain how to respond. The suited man remained nearby, now fully convinced of Jason's identity but no longer attempting to assert familiarity, instead observing quietly as though reassessing his own understanding of the situation. Sarah noticed that despite the recognition, Jason had not altered his demeanor, had not become more demanding or more detached, and instead remained anchored in the same calm presence he had maintained since the beginning of the evening, which made her reconsider everything she had assumed about him from the moment he walked in. A brief pause settled over their section as other diners resumed their conversations, unaware that the tone of the room had fundamentally changed, and Jason finally leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands in front of him again, as if concluding a private assessment rather than finishing a meal. Sarah stood at a short distance, unsure whether she should continue observing or return fully to service. But she found herself lingering because something about Jason Miller's behavior suggested that his purpose here had never been about being recognized, but about understanding something far less visible, and in that quiet realization, she sensed that the evening had not yet reached its conclusion, even though nothing else in the room appeared to be changing. The silence that followed Jason Miller's final words did not feel empty, but instead felt structured, as if the entire room had unconsciously agreed to slow down and absorb what had just been said, and even the background sounds of the steakhouse seemed more distant now, softened by the weight of awareness that had settled over every table. Sarah Collins remained near the service aisle, no longer pretending to be busy, because her attention had fully shifted toward the corner booth where Jason sat in the same composed posture, his meal now finished, his glass of water nearly empty, and his expression unchanged despite the fact that every person who mattered in the room now understood exactly who he was. Manager Richard Hayes stood slightly behind the bar with the suited man, both of them speaking less and observing more, their earlier confidence replaced by careful reconsideration, as though each sentence they exchanged now required internal review before being spoken aloud. Jason gently adjusted his jacket, not in preparation to leave, but in a way that suggested transition rather than conclusion, and Sarah noticed that for the first time since he arrived, he was no longer observing the room as a system, but instead allowing it to observe him without resistance. Richard finally gathered himself and approached the table once more, this time with noticeably more restraint in his tone. "Mr. Miller, we appreciate your visit this evening," he said, and there was a careful balance in his words, as if he was trying to preserve professionalism while acknowledging reality. Jason looked up at him calmly. "I did not come here for recognition," he replied, and the simplicity of the statement made Richard pause mid-breath, because it removed every assumption about status or expectation from the interaction. Sarah stepped slightly closer without realizing it, drawn by the quiet clarity in Jason's voice, and she noticed that even though nothing about his appearance had changed since he arrived, everything about how it was now perceived had shifted completely. The suited man finally spoke again, this time with more respect than curiosity. "If I may ask, what was the purpose of tonight?" And the question seemed to hang in the air longer than intended, because it was not just a question about presence, but about intent. Jason took a brief moment before answering, glancing once toward the dining room as if reviewing it one final time, "To observe how decisions are made when no one is watching for approval," he said, and that answer settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one immediately responded to. Sarah felt something subtle change in her understanding again, because she realized he had not been testing the food, the service, or even the management, but something far more intangible, which was how people treated others when they believed no consequences were attached to their assumptions. Richard lowered his gaze slightly, as if absorbing a truth he had not expected to confront on an ordinary evening, and even the suited man remained silent for a moment, reconsidering the entire interaction. From the beginning, Jason slowly stood from the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that suggested closure rather than departure, and as he did, Sarah instinctively stepped forward just enough to acknowledge the moment without interrupting it. Their eyes met briefly again, and this time there was no confusion in her expression, only recognition that whatever she had thought this night would be had already changed into something else entirely. Jason gave a slight nod, Not to the room, not to the manager, but to the space itself, as if acknowledging completion, and then he turned toward the exit. As he walked through the restaurant, conversations did not resume immediately, because the absence he left behind felt heavier than his presence had been, and Sarah remained still, watching him leave, not as a customer or a billionaire or a mystery, but as someone whose brief visit had quietly redefined how everyone in that room would now understand the difference between perception and truth. The door of the steakhouse closed behind Jason Miller with a soft sound that almost no one registered immediately, but the absence he left behind was impossible to ignore, as if the entire room had exhaled at once and now did not quite know how to inhale again. Sarah Collins remained standing near the edge of the dining floor, her eyes still fixed on the entrance long after he had disappeared into the night outside, where city lights reflected faintly on wet pavement and traffic moved without concern for anything that had just unfolded inside. Manager Richard Hayes slowly adjusted his stance near the bar, no longer speaking, no longer instructing, only watching the space where Jason had been seated, as if trying to reconstruct the evening from memory alone. The suited man remained beside him, silent now, his earlier certainty replaced with a thoughtful distance. As though the moment of recognition had opened something he was still processing, Sarah finally moved, not toward a table, not toward an order, but toward the front windows, where she could see Jason's figure briefly before he turned the corner and disappeared completely into the city, and she realized that nothing about him had been loud or dramatic, yet everything about his presence had changed the way the room now felt. Behind her, conversations slowly returned, but they were quieter, more measured, as if everyone was unconsciously recalibrating what they had just witnessed. Richard approached Sarah after a moment, his voice lower than before. "We should have handled that differently," he said, but Sarah did not respond immediately, because she was still thinking about Jason's words, about observation without expectation, about how easily assumptions had shaped the way he was treated even before anyone knew who he was. "I do not think there was anything to handle," she finally replied softly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her tone, and Richard looked at her as if trying to understand what had changed in her perspective within such a short span of time. Outside, Jason Miller walked along the sidewalk at an unhurried pace, blending into the rhythm of the city in a way that made it impossible for anyone passing by to recognize what had just occurred behind him, and yet his thoughts remained focused not on the reactions he left behind, but on what he had observed within them. He had seen hesitation before judgment, confidence before understanding, and adjustment before reflection, and in that sequence he found more clarity than in any formal report or presentation. Inside the restaurant, Sarah returned slowly to the service area, but she no longer moved with the same automatic rhythm she had earlier in the evening, because something in her understanding had shifted permanently, not toward admiration or confusion, but toward awareness that people often reveal their true structure only when they believe no one important is watching. Richard eventually broke the silence near the bar, speaking quietly to the suited man about upcoming reservations and private bookings. But even that conversation lacked its earlier certainty, as if the foundation beneath their usual decisions had subtly changed. Sarah looked once more toward the empty table, now cleared and reset as if nothing significant had happened, and yet she knew the impression would remain long after the physical presence was gone, because Jason Miller had not only eaten dinner there, he had quietly tested the invisible boundaries of perception itself and left without needing to declare what he had found.